Are we ready? Are you all ready? Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. My name's Annie Rowan. I'm the Director of Partnerships and External Relations at Stanford PAX. I'm delighted today to open up our fall public speaker series for 2017-2018 academic calendar here at Stanford. We are Stanford PAX, the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. We are led by 3 faculty co-directors across the university, Paul Brest, Woody Powell, and Rob Reish. We are an interdisciplinary center, and we specifically look at research that helps inform the social change sector. We do that by publishing written materials, putting events up online like this, hosting convenings, and also publishing the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Lucy Byrne, who will lead the conversation. Just as a little bit of housekeeping, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the discussion, so hold your questions. We'll pass around a mic. Lucy will moderate. Please keep those questions coming. It'll be an exciting opportunity for you to ask questions of the speaker and of Lucy. Without further ado, then, introducing Lucy Byrne. She is a senior research scholar at Stanford University and the director of our Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford PAX. She has a PhD from Stanford University, but in between getting her PhD and coming back here to Stanford PAX, she has been a leading voice in social change in the sector, so out there with practitioners, truly making a change in the world. Recently, right before coming to Stanford PAX, she was a visiting practitioner at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and that led to her work here at the Digital Civil Society Lab. She is the author of the Blueprint series, which many of you may have read, and if you haven't, you should. Those of you watching us out on live stream, you can download this on our website if you can't get a copy in person. The newest Blueprint, which will be the 10th in the series, is being released in December and also can be downloaded from our website. You can read her full bio in the program, which you have in hand, and again is online if you're watching from afar. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the conversation to Lucy. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Annie, and welcome to our guests on the live stream. So in case you haven't gathered it by now, this is being live streamed. It's also being videoed and archived and will be available on the lab website. In the future, there's the light that says, yes, for sure, it's being videoed. As Annie said, I'm Lucy Byrne. I'm the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab. I'm going to kick off this evening by telling you a little bit about the lab and the work we do, and introducing my colleagues here. And where they fit into that work. So the Digital Civil Society Lab was launched in 2014, and we're interested in 2 kinds of questions. We're very focused on trying to better understand the shape and contours of civil society and democracies in an age in which we are all dependent on digital data and infrastructure. So you can think of this as one side of a Mobius strip. We're trying to understand the ways that the digital political economy shapes civil society, and in turn then how that is shaping the democracy that we live in here in the US and democracies around the world. But there's 2 sides to that set of equations, which is the set of roles and responsibilities and possibilities for civil society to in turn shape digital political economy. So the ways in which we each as people experience the use of digital data, our data about us are used, the way we access digital infrastructure, questions of that nature. These are hot topics right now. If you pick up any newspaper, you'll discover that the world is quite concerned about the intersection of the internet and democracy. And we share that concern. Our frame for all of our work is in the context of democracy theory, and we base our understanding of civil society and its responsibilities, its structures, and its possibilities in that frame. Those are big problems. So we're very fortunate to be based here at Stanford PAX and to be able to bring 3 different kinds of work to try to better understand those questions. We support and conduct pure scholarly research in addition to our fellows program, which the 3 fellows joining me on stage tonight. We have postdoctoral scholars who are scholars in their disciplines who've completed their doctoral work here or elsewhere and are pursuing additional research. And we're very excited to be able to support that kind of pure academic scholarship. And for those people to be here on campus engaging from the computer science department to the philosophy department, able to take advantage of all the different disciplinary approaches to these questions. We also, as Annie mentioned, PACS writ large and the lab in general, try to make our work practical and useful to people who are out in the world doing social change work now, but also living through this experience of transitioning from a world that was fully analog to one that is fully analog and digital. And in that regard, we support the digital impact community. We've made available the digitalimpact.io toolkit. We do all of the kind of publishing that Annie mentioned, where we're actually trying to make research both available to the world, but also our research is very practice-based. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, because that's what brings these fine folks here. And then the last piece of our work is focused on policy issues and trying to understand what the legal frames, regulatory issues, opportunities, needs are around these kinds of questions. But I want to say a little bit about my colleagues here as an experiment. They're not an experiment in people. They're fully fledged, whole hog people. And we're delighted to have them. And I'll introduce them in a minute. I'm just going to continue to talk about you in third person as objects for a moment, so forgive me. This is an experiment in what I think is no less than the future of higher education, and also the future of change in the social sector. Sean McDonald at the end, Asha Curran here in the middle, Josh Levy to my immediate right, are all fully employed practitioners in the social sector. But we've created a fellowship program with the support of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and Microsoft Corporation that's truly an experiment in trying to find people who are in the world doing the work, who have ideas that are transformative, and who will benefit from, those ideas will benefit from, and the people will benefit from the opportunity to pressure test those ideas, to improve those ideas, to engage those ideas with scholars here on campus at Stanford and elsewhere, and in turn, in fact, make those ideas better, bring them out into the world, informed by the best that the research community has to offer, and in turn, inform the research agenda. So it is very much a two-way street. As I said, I think it's no less than the future of higher education. I hope there will be many, many more opportunities like this. We think of it as research in practice. And with that, I'm truly delighted to say just a few more things. And then, I promise, I'll introduce them. I'm going to get there. A couple of framing assumptions that I think are important so that you can engage in the conversation with us. Digital data are a new asset class, which means they're also a new liability. And I use the word new somewhat reservedly because the data as an asset class has been out there for a while, but we're still acting as if it just came upon us yesterday and we just realized this, and it's too late for that. We have to move beyond that to a point where we are fully incorporating into the practices and governance of our organization recognition of our dependence on this resource and our opportunities to use it. And that's part of what these three folks have in common. In order to do that, we need to develop collectively, as a research community and as a community of practitioners and policymakers, new norms for this, new practices, new policies at the organizational level, and yes, new laws. We need new laws, we need new norms, we need to understand what it means for civil society to thrive in democracies in order to also simultaneously figure out how we can use this resource to its greatest good. Each of these three fellows is approaching this basic observation in very different ways. They're each going to tell you a little bit about their actual work in the world. They're not working together. Their work doesn't necessarily interact with each other, but collectively, from the perspective of the lab that's trying to keep an eye on the sector as a whole, they add up to pieces of the future. And their work may well, as we'll learn in this conversation, actually directly interact. But they're three discrete projects, each which I hope you'll think about, at least for the course of this conversation, as an example in the new types of capacities that we need to build in the social sector and the new kind of capacity building that we need then in the social sector. We've framed the conversation as a dilemma, shared and secure. They're two sides of a coin. digital data, digital dependencies, digital technology, algorithmic analysis. This is our toolkit now, and it holds incredible potential if we can maximize the way to use this resource in ways that align with our larger values. If we can develop the governance structures and the use of the technological capacities in ways that better humankind, whatever that might mean, and we probably do need to define that, then we have an absolute new tool to try to make the world a better place. If we don't do those two things simultaneously, or at least concurrently, then we may not actually be making progress. So shared and secure, how do we do both? How do we maximize the use of this resource, get the most good out of it, do the least harm? That's one way of thinking the question. The way this is going to work is I'm actually now going to stop talking. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. I'm going to ask Asha Curran from the 92nd Street Y to take a few minutes and introduce us to your work. Josh Levy from the Digital Security Exchange will then do the same. Sean will then take the podium and another 3 minutes sort of explaining quickly his project. They'll all sit down. I'll pepper them with questions. They'll pepper me back with questions. We'll invite you into the conversation, and we'll all learn something. So with that, Asha Curran from the Belfer Center for Innovation and Impact and Givingtuesday in New York.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Lucy. Thank you to Rob. Thank you to Microsoft. Thank you to Jessica. It's really an honor to be here. Givingtuesday was actually initially incubated at PAX, and so this seems very fitting and kind of full circle that I'm back here talking to all of you about it now. So I'll give a sort of brief overview of Givingtuesday and sort of where we came from, where we are now, and what I'm trying to do here at the Digital Civil Society Lab, and hopefully not go on too long, as I certainly am capable of doing when it comes to Givingtuesday. So Givingtuesday is an annual day of giving following, well, initially conceived of as following Black Friday and Cyber Monday. Here in the United States, a day to give in whatever way felt meaningful to people, a day to solicit funds in whatever way felt meaningful to nonprofit organizations. Although we felt very strongly that the money is important. Nonprofit organizations need resource to address the very important causes they exist to address. We didn't want to focus only on money. We felt like the important thing here was to invite more people into the conversation about giving, a conversation that, like many conversations, had been kept far too elite, far too exclusive, far too closed for far too long. And so we introduced it as a sort of open source idea available for anyone to take, anyone to change, anyone to adapt, which was kind of new nonprofit thinking. That very first year that Givingtuesday existed, we launched it 60 days in advance of the day itself, where normally that would have been 365 days plus 60 days in normal sort of nonprofit strategizing, getting an idea onto market. And that was a really important decision. We also made another really important decision, which was to drop the name of our organization entirely off of the name of Givingtuesday. That's an exercise that we've come to think of as unbranding, and that also at the time, and still now, was actually quite a radical decision for a nonprofit to make. We didn't create this idea to take credit for it. We didn't create it to see our logo slapped everywhere. We created it as a question, right? Is the idea of giving going to be resonant as a public conversation, as a public act? If people are willing to share what they ate for breakfast and how many miles they ran that morning on their social channels, would they be willing to share what they care about and what they give to? It was an open question. We didn't know the answer to it. The answer turned out to be yes. Here's where we are now with Givingtuesday. We launched in that 60 days. We hoped that 100 nonprofit partners would say, all right, we'll sign on. We weren't even asking them to do much. We were saying, we'll publicize you if you agree to say, we'll tweet on this day, we'll do a campaign on this day. And we had 2,500 nonprofit partners sign up in that first 60 days. The amount that we were able to measure that was raised online was $10 million more than the previous year on that same day, which we now look at as our baseline. And this past year, 2016, Givingtuesday, from what we were able to count, online only raised north of $180 million just in that 24-hour period, just online. almost certainly a fraction of the total amount, including offline dollars that we're not able to count. But more importantly, Giving Tuesday is an inclusive movement. And I call it a movement mindfully, knowing that there are a lot of opinions about who and what can use that phrase. I call Giving Tuesday a movement because it moves by itself. And it is moved by its community. It is moved by the community globally that engages with it. When people identify me as the leader of Giving Tuesday, I correct and say I am actually the follower of Giving Tuesday. I notice where amazing organic things are growing out of the movement, and I do my best to cultivate and steward them and to shepherd the incredible community that Giving Tuesday now is. But these are just a few of the many, many ways that people have adapted Giving Tuesday and made it their own, made it Dia de Doar in Brazil and Un Dia para Dar in Spain and Panama and Uruguay, and things I can't pronounce in Croatia and Russia and many other places. Giving Tuesday is certainly has been a beneficiary of influencers like President Obama, but the woman on the right has always been my sort of my touchstone when I try to remind myself of the guiding principles of Giving Tuesday. I may not be famous, I don't have $1 million, but I can help change lives on Giving Tuesday. And the more people that feel that way, the more people I feel like are representing the future of the social sector and civil society in becoming enfranchised and becoming accountable for it. These are a few ways that organizations have adapted Giving Tuesday to be their own thing. You know, in the nonprofit world, adapting Giving Tuesday to be Giving Shoes Day or Giving Teas Day or Giving Catholic Day could be the reason to issue a cease and desist letter. There are nonprofits that trademark the color of their logo, right? But we decided to take exactly the opposite tack and see what happened, knowing that we are in an age where people connect and consume and think and give differently, fundamentally differently than they did a generation ago. And the transactional giving that happened for many, many, many years on December 31st to get a tax write-off is simply not the kind of giving that people want to engage in now. They want to engage in transformational giving, not transactional giving. So what brings me here to the Digital Civil Society Lab is that over the course of the years that Giving Tuesday has existed, it has amassed a massive amount of very, very interesting but totally unmined data. And that data has really interesting things to tell us about everything from crowdfunding and workplace giving to changing giving behaviors and what are real best practices that exist now, not the same ones that consultants have been telling us have existed for 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades, but what are actually the things that exist now that nonprofits can do to better be able to meet their missions. And in service of that question, we started collaborating with the people who hold donor data, which are these giving platforms. In 2015, we worked with 24 of them to ask them about their online donations. The following year, in 2016, we asked over 40 of them. And we are now working with them to examine their transactional data, to examine everything from gender-based giving to age and geography and what spurs people to give in this digital age, all so we can create actionable, useful tools and resources for the sector, not just here in the United States, but all over the world to do a better job. So we've found things that are really interesting so far. For example, that Giving Tuesday acts as a sort of positive natural disaster. In other words, giving spikes just as it does after a national disaster, but there is no corresponding dip in giving. So what that has told us is that there is a net lift to giving caused by Giving Tuesday. But I have learned in my very, very recent foray into thinking about data that I have so much to learn, and that this is a subject that needs to be treated with the utmost care and the utmost responsibility. And so what brings me here to PAX and to DCSL is simply to learn from the best. Just as we turned to Rob and Lucy in the very beginning of Giving Tuesday, we're now turning to them at a more mature moment for the movement to think about how we can use this data responsibly, wisely, entrepreneurially, and for the good of the entire world.
Thanks, Asha. Perfectly. So Josh is going to tell you a little bit about his work with the Digital Security Exchange.
Is that working? Yeah. Hi, everybody. How's it going? My name's Josh Levy. I'm the founder and director of the Digital Security Exchange. This is a project that Lucy very generously took interest in earlier this year that I started developing really the day after the 2016 election. The reason why was because I started hearing all of this stuff literally on that Wednesday morning. Nonprofit organizations, civil society organizations, progressive folks, conservative folks, people who use the internet to organize, most of them had built their organizations and their networks using the internet, but very few of them had thought much about digital security, about the vulnerabilities that they face online and the ways in which they can be attacked online by trolls, by hackers, by doxers, et cetera, et cetera. But suddenly, that morning, on Signal, which I use religiously, I got all these notifications that so-and-so is using Signal, and so-and-so is using Signal, and so-and-so is using Signal. And I thought, what's going on here? And I realized that for the first time, for a lot of these people, they felt threatened online, and they realized that they needed to do something about it. But they didn't know where to turn to. And the reality was that if you were to Google digital security for nonprofits and civil society, or if you were to go on Twitter and ask somebody for tips, you heard a lot of random responses. Here's a blog post. Here's my blog post on how to use Signal, right? Check out this awesome in-depth guide to digital self-defense. Always use two-factor authentication and preferably a YubiKey. Use Tor. Much of this was jargon. Probably all of it was jargon. And while some of it may have been helpful, I think a lot of it was lost on people who felt very vulnerable in that moment. And so what I decided was that, hey, I know a lot of people who do digital security work. I do a little bit of digital security training myself with progressive organizations, and at the time I was working with an organization that did it internationally. And I also had a lot of friends in different social sector networks that needed help, and I realized that I was one of the few people who could connect one constituency to another. And so I decided to build something, a mechanism that would create that kind of matchmaking service. And that's became the Digital Security Exchange. And our tagline, testing it out on you, is helping the social sector stay safe from social attack, right? And by social sector, we mean kind of the groups that I just mentioned, right? It's not just certain kind of nonprofit organization. It's not just progressive organizations or conservative, but really it's groups that are largely underfunded, under-resourced, helping to serve the needs of their communities, whether that means regional, local communities or networked, distributed communities. And they frequently don't have the capacity or resources to even think about what does digital security mean for us? What kinds of threats are we facing on a daily basis? What does this political and social moment of upheaval mean for us in the work we're trying to do? So we're here to help them answer those questions and then to help them connect to folks who can actually take things a step further and help secure their infrastructure against attack. So since we started this whole thing, and by we, I mean me, we have gotten pretty far, and there's a lot to report. We've created a kind of informal system for doing this matchmaking, and we've started to work with about 10 digital security providers who offered their services to connect to organizations seeking assistance. We're working with about 10 organizations who are seeking assistance, and so that's a pretty good matching set of numbers there. We are hoping to scale that up, but before we do that, we've got to build some infrastructure, and so that's what we're doing. We're building an online intake system that will ideally make it much easier for organizations to identify their needs and bring those needs to us. And then for digital security providers, of which there are many, but they are kind of hidden among us, to register their interest in helping. And then we're going to build a back-end piece of that infrastructure that's going to help us connect A to B. We're building partnerships. We have a partnership with a group that's doing this work in the Middle East, North Africa region, and we're sharing some of the infrastructure there that they've built. And I think that there are other opportunities to work with groups around the world that are thinking about this in the same kind of way. They're not the primary responders to the need. They are helping to create more capacity for responders to meet the need that's out there. So hopefully by And I say hopefully because if anybody's built a website, things don't always go to plan. But the idea is by the end of this year, we're going to have some infrastructure, some public-facing infrastructure in place, and we're going to double our provider network by the end of the first quarter of next year, and we're going to have some great documentation to share. There is great documentation about what to do if you're concerned about digital security, but it's hard to find and it's hard to understand, and so we're helping to make it more findable and also to make it more understandable. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Sean?
Hello. So my name's Sean McDonald. I'm here with a project called the Digital Public. And sort of my day job is working with a software company that tries to produce open source tools in the public interest globally. And one of the things that I learned while setting down that adventurous path was how important the law and in many ways business decision making ends up being in the way that our digital rights end up getting decided. So with a colleague named Keith Porcaro, we started developing something called the Digital Civic Trust. And the Digital Civic Trust is a literal legal trust. So it's the tools that we use to protect large, dynastic, inheritable wealth repurposed for protecting the public interest. And there are really two main problems that we think this solves, or that we think it can solve. The first is digital estate planning. As Lucy said, intellectual property, digital assets, whether they are data or code or any number of other things, algorithms, are becoming wealth. They are an asset class into themselves, and they represent an attendant number of opportunities and an attendant number of risks. When we think about how we build and plan organizations, you have a revenue strategy. You may have a security strategy. We certainly think you should have a digital estate planning strategy. And one of the things in particular that we find is that there are billions of dollars invested every year into the social sector, into some of the most financially fragile vehicles and organization types that you could possibly create. So we're putting all of this money and all of this hope and all of these great ideas into this extremely fragile framework. And at the very least, what we should be doing is recognizing that and maybe not accepting the inevitable end of organizations, but maybe planning for it. For those that have built wills, this will seem very familiar. For those who haven't built wills, please build a will. It's just, everyone will thank you, not in a way you'll know, but when it's important. And at the organizational level, this is also true. We think about this at the individual level. We don't think about this in the way that we build and structure governance, in the way that we build and structure a lot of our sort of social sector assets. And we've lost a lot along the way. We've lost cancer research, we've lost civic data, we've lost access to rights. There are all kinds of ways in which this is a hugely powerful concept. And by putting intellectual property assets into a trust, we both protect it and we potentially make it available from a legal perspective for future generations and for lots of other additional uses. The second part of this is just acknowledging a little bit of what we don't know. So many of you may have heard of human in the loop. It's primarily used around algorithm or AI training, but it is this idea that we want a human voice, we want a group of people who are involved in making the decisions that define how technology systems frame our rights and frame the outcomes that are important to us. There's a follow-on bit to human in the loop, which is society in the loop. And that sort of school of thinking recognizes that it's a lot of responsibility to put on one person to be the only one in the loop, right? We want someone to be representative of lots of different perspectives, understand all kinds of different threat models, potentially marginalizing factors. So then there's the society in the loop gap, or the society in the loop approach. And that essentially says we need lots and lots of different perspectives informing the way that companies and particularly digital platforms make decisions about how they use technology and how they use data to achieve outcomes. The way that societies make decisions is governance. The way that We build structures for lots and lots of perspectives to feed into singular decisions is governance. And so the thing that makes digital civic trust civic is this idea that you can build and embed lightweight governance. You can build city councils in the ownership structures of assets. I understand that may not be as exciting to everybody as it is to me, but trusts are this incredibly old, they're the oldest way that we protect public interest. Many of you probably have been to national parks or heard of land trusts. We protect hundreds of millions of acres for the public good just in the United States using trusts. In the UK, they've built something called civic trusts. Civic trusts are essentially county councils, city councils, small groups of people who devote their kind of volunteer effort to make decisions based on how assets are used to ensure that they kind of maximize public benefit and achieve the aim for which they were created or donated or purchased. That same idea can exist and should exist, I think, in digital spaces. And so what we're doing is taking the civic trust model, which is a very old idea, and adapting it into sort of 21st century markets and infrastructure using intellectual property assets. So in a lot of ways, my hope is that we are kind of using the flexible and exciting private law tools that are available to build a sort of more equitable and just set of digital decisions and digital civil societies. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. So thanks to each of them, Asha, Josh, and Sean. I want to get a little more detail out for folks to try to make some sense of. Asha, you've talked about the distributed nature of Givingtuesday. I mean, some of the power of it is that it's out in the world and people can do with it as they choose. As you're in this position now of juggling these partnerships with the payment processing platforms, the folks who actually, when you click donate now, that's where the money goes through this process and eventually gets to the nonprofit. But they're a big part of the ecosystem you're now working with. And you've talked about one of the key reasons for doing this work at all is to help the nonprofits around the world be better at what they're doing. So help us think through that chain. What is your vision of how a small nonprofit in Kashmir or in Kansas is going to benefit from what you're trying to figure out in negotiating this complicated set of data relationships between 45 different competing companies, all of this data about people, and that small nonprofit in Kansas? How do we get from you making sense of that data to that organization working better?
So the Givingtuesday community exists now as a sort of global learning lab or innovation lab where leaders have emerged. Leaders I think of as the future of the social sector globally because they share really important personality characteristics, actually, in being entrepreneurial and experimental, creative, collaborative by nature, risk tolerant, right? These are not qualities that one always associates with the nonprofit world. And so it actually stands to reason that they are the ones who raised their hand and said, I'm going to take a risk by adopting this idea and applying it to the sector in my region. They don't just operate in their region. They are highly interconnected. They talk all day, every day via various platforms. They share ideas, they share learnings, they share what worked and what doesn't work. They cheer each other on. The WhatsApp group that they communicate on is emoji heavy. But
it's for emojis.
Right, but really, really supportive of each other's wins, and that is such a basic sort of paradigm shift from what I'm used to in the sort of scarcity mindset of there's this finite pool of donor dollars and we're all competing for it. It's like the anti-competition, the Givingtuesday community. So one of the ways that they're helped is simply that mode of communication, right? Something worked in Baltimore, right? Baltimore created a Givingtuesday campaign called Be More Gives More. They involved the city government, the local nonprofits, the local giving platforms. They raised the small businesses, everything. They raised schools, churches. They raised $5.5 million the first year of Giving Tuesday. The leader in Brazil the following year was traveling around Brazil talking about all these Giving Tuesday stories, traveled to a small town called Sorocaba, actually a mid-sized town, that was so inspired by the example of Baltimore that they replicated exactly what they had done. Like, that's a really clear line there. It didn't take a long time. It didn't involve any white papers. It didn't involve somebody reading articles, then tried to write a strategy paper about how they might replicate. Like, they just did it, right? So now the question is, I realize that because I've had the privilege of traveling around and visiting the people who are trying to strengthen civil society and the foundations of democracy and the social sector in countries where it is so much more of a challenge than we have here. And I feel like we patted ourselves on the back for creating something really special here, but we did it in a culture that has a long history of philanthropy, a long history of individual donations, and that is not true of all the communities that are really trying to leverage this to strengthen donation culture in these places. So the question is, how can we learn what we can learn here based on transactional data from these giving platforms who are performing an act of philanthropy themselves in lending us that data to analyze? They're under no obligation to do that whatsoever. And in fact, they're taking a risk, right? They might share information that ends up benefiting a competitive platform. That itself is an example of sector generosity. So what we want to do is learn all we can so that we can then feed that out into the global network so that everybody can become better. The small nonprofit in Kansas, the small one in Kashmir, the leaders in those different countries, right? So there's multiple layers, but those shared learnings benefit everyone.
Great, and that will, I assume, the idea is that hopefully that will be as sort of reinforcing as just the kind of learning about how to host the event in the first place, that you'll get better ideas from the community next year, for example, about what kinds of questions to ask of the data, like what do they want to know?
Absolutely. Yeah. What would be useful for them to know, and then also from if we're like one minor step ahead in creating a sort of system, right, which is what we're trying to do now, the process, the governance, the infrastructure for gathering, doing all of this responsibly, getting good information out there into the sector, how do we then replicate that at a global level?
Interesting. Great. Fantastic. So there's an interesting parallel, unintentional probably, since the projects aren't affiliated, but you launched a digital security exchange, not a digital security nonprofit. Why is it an exchange? Why is it a network? Why is it also sort of this matching model thing? What? That's my question. What?
Also, how?
Yeah, can I? Oh, I got it. Because I couldn't think of a better name. No, it's
It's being archived, Josh.
So it's a good question. So I've always thought of this digital security exchange project very similar to what you're talking about as not even a matchmaking platform, although that's a metaphor that I think is useful when trying to understand what we're doing, but as a knowledge exchange, right? So it's not just that I'm a digital security expert and I have expertise to bring to this nonprofit organization that doesn't know what it's doing. It's not that at all. In fact, the nonprofit organization has a lot to bring to the digital security provider. And one of the challenges that we're facing now is that you can be a senior engineer at Cisco who specializes in malware analysis or in phishing attacks, but not understand the needs of a civil society organization, not understand the human rights context of a certain organization or a social justice organization. So they can actually, and we're working on ways to do this, learn from those organizations what the specific threats that they're facing are and how to work with those organizations in a very particular way to make sure they're getting what they need. And so the more that information flows back to the providers, the more effective those providers can be with the next organization that they're going to work with. And a lot of organizations or a lot of providers are interested in this. We're in a moment where people are very activated, and especially people with a high level of technological skill don't always know where to put that expertise and what to do with it. And so that exchange, again, they have services to provide, but they have a lot to learn from the others, and I think everybody starts benefiting the more that we can build those connections. And so it's a lot more than just a flat matchmaking system.
So it's a knowledge exchange. It's the idea that both sides benefit. There's two kinds of expertise, at least, if you will, then. The technological security expertise, the issue area, and civil society expertise. As you talk about governance in the loop, which I'll admit to being a concept that I've had to think about a lot, is that a little bit of what you're getting at, though, that there's decisions needing to be made by multiple perspectives in an ongoing way? These aren't one-off decisions. Can you unpack the governance in the loop idea for me a little bit, and does it build on any of this kind of in the world, in practice recognition that the nonprofit in Brazil has as much to share with the nonprofit in Baltimore and vice versa, and together that is beneficial to everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think full disclosure, Givingtuesday is probably better branded than most forms of governance. But I think that where the idea is that participation in the system teaches you a whole bunch about the trade-offs, what our values are, what the practical manifestations of those values look like. And I think that governance, when done well and when inclusive and participatory and meaningful, teaches people a huge amount, not only about the process, but about sort of the underlying economies. And the idea behind governance in the loop is that right now, we have a lot of closed-door decision-making determining what was historically public policy. And that there are a lot of voices, and we read about this, like you said, all the time. I don't know about it, it's in the newspaper, but like people who read the news are always hearing about.
Oh, you mean it's not actually on a paper form? You read the news some other way now?
I think you can print it out. I think you can still print it out. No, but the idea is that we need a bigger tent, right? We need more people involved in making the decisions that define our norms, particularly the norms around social sector and kind of public interest work. And so the Society in the Loop piece started talking about essentially we need a bigger tent, and kind of made a really good faith effort at describing what that, like the first version of what that might look like. There are a lot of different ways that communities govern shared assets. And I think that it's important to start from honoring and instantiating those forms of community governance, and have, that we as a digital civil society adapt to and learn from those forms of governance in the 21st century. So how do we apply the kind of commons knowledge that we've developed through community governance into digital ecosystems?
And this is, so there's big governance questions. It's kind of in an ongoing, continuous process way, which certainly captures what you described, Asha, in terms of the way Givingtuesday, the community itself, is now growing and robust and helping itself, if you will. And now there's this additional asset, the data, that you're trying to figure out how to make that help. Help me figure something out, though, Josh, about security, digital security. Is it the gateway drug to data governance? I mean, is security a subset of data governance? Is it a different thing? Is it the thing that everybody wakes up sweating at night about, and that makes them start wondering about how do I manage this resource in general? How do you think about that? And is the digital security exchange, well, let me just add, there. Is it part of the larger sphere of governance, or is it something separate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just a fundamental level of data literacy that needs to happen that just isn't in place. And that's no one's fault. That's the reason for that is what we've all kind of alluded to. Nonprofit organizations are under-resourced. They're under capacity. They have too few people working on too many things, making not enough money. And so very rarely will there arise organically this notion of, hey, but what about our data? And we should come up with a governance model for it, right? Sometimes that may happen, but I think it's rare. Security, because it's a fundamental practical matter. We like to talk about it in terms of, you should be thinking about the digital security of your organization, like you think about the finances and the bookkeeping and all these kind of like boring operational things that are fundamental to running your operation. Security is one of those things, right? So I think in a way it is a gateway drug. Once you start thinking about the data that you generate, the data that comes into you, where you store the data, where it goes, when you share it, then you have to start thinking about, well, how do we govern this? How do we come up with a set of processes that allows us to think about this in ways that nails the data retention problem? The sharing of data between organizations is not a trivial matter, and you have to start thinking about not only the technology, but also the governance of that data. And I think that's why Sean's project is so important, because you have to think about what if, God forbid, this organization doesn't exist anymore. Well, we've generated all of these assets. Where are these things going to go? So yeah, I would love to see the security conversation kind of level up to a data governance conversation in some kind of like organic way.
Because it's not there now. It's a capacity. Where is it? So let me, and this is actually a question for all of you then. When I think of governance in civil society or at a nonprofit, I'm thinking it's the board of directors, right? Like that's their job. Is security now not at that level? It's a staff thing or it's a non-thing? And so that's what I mean. Like when you say you want to level it up to a governance issue, is there something? Because it seems to me that the route that Sean is investigating, and to some degrees that Asha's living in the middle of, right? Here's this partnership between a not-for-profit organization in New York, 45 commercial and nonprofit platforms plus, right? And like, what's the question here? What are the components of what the group making decisions about the resource? What are the components of what they may need to, what the decisions they need to make? So you're saying you think security is one of them. That group ought to be thinking about protecting the resource. And now I'm absolutely putting words in your mouth, so if that's not what you're saying, don't say it. But I'm wondering what the other things they need to think about are. And that you're living, as you negotiate with the 45 platforms, what do they ask you about? Do they ask about how do we protect the privacy of the people? You know, what is the component of the governance problem set, for lack of a better term?
Who's that for?
It's for all of you, but if nobody wants to answer it, I'll move on to another question.
I mean, I'll jump on it and hope it doesn't explode. I think
That's a
security,
terrible
I think that
metaphor.
security is necessary but not sufficient.
Okay,
And
so
I
it's a
think-
piece, but not the whole.
I think it's the ability to make a promise in a limited context, right? If I say that something is protected, then my security practices are what make me a credible person or a credible organization in making that promise. And I think that there are lots of ways in which decisions get made, predominantly around use. Is this better? Yeah, all right, cool. Oh yeah, no, thanks. I often get accused of being too quiet. So I think that there are lots of decisions that we don't really know the answer to, which are mostly about how it gets used, by whom, under what conditions, for what purpose. And I imagine that a number of your sort of relationships kind of reflect concerns about what information gets released, under what conditions, under what timeline. But I think that there's the governance components of it are, governance is a little bit like design. It's never not happening. It's just done badly when no one talks about it. And I think that that's most of what is happening in sort of data ecosystems and data intermediary ecosystems at the moment. It's not that there aren't governance decisions being made. It's just that they're not considering the full palette of opportunities and risks that civil society organizations might otherwise explore.
And back then, in your negotiations, Asha, with the platforms that right now have this data that you're trying to figure out a way to unleash and make sense of so that people can do their work better, is your negotiations, from what I've heard you talk about, is it's contractual at this point. You're addressing a number of sort of, here's what we can do with it now for this purpose, And the question that you're thinking about in the larger project is how do we sustain, what does that look like over time? So that it's not just a set of contracts every year? Is that?
No, I don't think, I think it's actually much less contractual than it is, I know, casual and relational, right? Giving Tuesday has the benefit of being a trusted, neutral source. We have no skin in this game, right? Giving Tuesday is not its own organization. It is a project of the 92nd Street Y. It's not branded. We don't actively take credit for it. So we occupy this sort of really interesting neutral space where we have all of these different stakeholders to think about. We're not managing them, though, right? They're doing their own thing. Nonprofits are a stakeholder, and they run the gamut from massive to tiny, and all over the world, right? Corporations are another, small businesses another, religious institutions another, giving platforms another. So we're less negotiating with them than we have spent 6 years building relationships with them, turning to them to find out what worked for them and what didn't. And then we said, will you give us this data so we can look at it and find some useful things? And they said, yeah. And, it's like the famous dance party example, right? Where if you haven't read the Open Data Dance Party blog post, it's really great, where one person starts dancing in a public park and looks insane. But then, after a little while, someone else just decides to go and join them, and they're both dancing in this park, and then a few more people go, and before you know it, it's like a mob of people dancing in a park. Our data project was like that, right? Like, first it was like one platform, and then it was 4 platforms, and then it was 20 platforms, and then it was 40 platforms. And, once people are playing, more people want to play, right? And then everybody benefits, because each platform has a sort of distinct niche in, right? Big nonprofits, small nonprofits, higher ed institutions, et cetera. And so the more of them we can corral, the better picture we're getting as a whole, right? And that's really what we want to do. So I don't think we want to do ongoing negotiations every year. I think what we want to do is form a strong collaborative network where everybody is driving toward the same goal, which is to get a better picture of giving in America, to enable the whole sector to be better, to make more money, to attract more leadership, to communicate better, to adopt digital tools, and all sorts of things.
The other thing that it seems clear to me from listening to the three of you, that each of the approaches you're taking has in common, is a recognition now that people with digital skills, so I'll include that being data scientists, coders, data wranglers, lawyers who understand intellectual property, among other things, they are a core part of the work that you're doing. They're digital security experts. There is core to the organizations you're working with being able to achieve their mission. If not directly, because that small nonprofit in Kansas is not going to hire its own data scientist, but somebody who can make sense of this with them and for them, they have to have access to that somehow. Fair? Is that?
I actually think it's more that every single staff member and person should have a basic level of digital literacy rather than depending on the experts. I think that's actually one of the problems.
So the skills are what matter. The knowledge is what matters.
The skills, the knowledge, the knowledge of even where to turn for the knowledge, right? So there's tons of those skills that I don't have, but I certainly know where to turn to fill in those gaps. And I think that's a problem. I know you and I differ on this, but I think that many nonprofits are still hiring leaders who don't speak who are not fluent in those languages. And I don't think those CEOs have to be coders, right?
No,
but I think they have to
say.
Understand the digital world.
So let me qualify my question again. There's a fabulous paper written about the changes in the journalism field. It's by Kate Crawford and Mike Anani, Mike is at USC and Kate is at Microsoft in New York and at Harvard. And it's called The Liminal Press. And it's an argument that, in fact, in an age when people like Sean get his news not off of dead trees, the way I do, the people who design the feed that feeds him the news and the interface that you interact with that news are as important in your experience of consuming the news as was the reporter and the editor at the old Fifth and Mission in San Francisco, okay? That they are designing the news process. That not to say any editor needs to know how to do that, but that we must begin to recognize that the news business now includes UX designers and coders and intellectual property law. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. That civil society, when we like to think of it as, oh, it's nonprofits and foundations and we'll throw in a few social movements and maybe a political protester just to understand. No, it's more than that. It's all these people who understand the data ecosystem, the infrastructure, the nature of the resource, or it needs to become that. That's my question. Is that true? Is that what we need to get to? Is that the capacity that we need to build in all the different ways you're working on that?
So I would say absolutely. And the story about fish not knowing that they're swimming in water, which I have no idea if that's true. They might know.
It's a frog.
It's a frog?
Never mind. Different
Boiling.
different parable. Yeah, never mind.
But I do think that nonprofits are very often slow to change, and they have conservative kind of models of doing business, and if something worked to raise money 10 years ago, it kind of gets repeated until it doesn't work anymore. And that's not to speak ill of nonprofits. It's just the way it often works. I don't think there's an awareness that we are swimming in data, and that it is the fuel that engines kind of all of our work, whether or not we're aware of it. And becoming aware of it and becoming critical in our understanding of it is really important. And we are all in a place where that we do that. We have become critics of media and of technology in this way, but most nonprofit staff are not. So we have to find a way to develop that skill set in not just individual staffers, but at the organizational level. And until you do that, you're not going to tackle the security problem. You're certainly not going to tackle the data governance problem. You're not going to really be able to come up with these kind of innovative ways of sharing data and helping to lift all boats if you're not understanding the data as a resource. And instead it's just kind of a nuisance, or it's something to be filed away in an Exchange server.
Right. Or protect it. Do you want to add something, Sean?
I'm super colored by the fact that I wrote my master's thesis on the digitization of journalism ecosystem. So I will spare you all of that boredom, but just to say that actually commercial control of distribution networks existed long before the internet. And in many parts of the world, to Josh's point, understanding the ecosystem in which you're swimming is sort of the first step to being able to sort of strategically operate in it. And I think that, in a lot of ways, security is an important part of that work. Having a legal or intellectual property strategy is part of that work. Inviting more people into how you share and develop norms and learn from that ecosystem is also part of that work. I think it's difficult to say this group of people. I really struggle with the term literacy, because literacy is often that kind of term where you're like, people need to learn the way that we operate. And I think that what all of us are trying to do is take what are relatively intellectually dense professions and make them more accessible in a way that lifts all boats. And I think that that's, in a way, and it's kind of the anti-literacy, or it's at least like a better way to learn to read. And I think that that's, in a lot of ways, kind of understanding the ecosystem and knowing who to call and knowing that there are resources and opportunities and support and community makes such a huge difference in the way that nonprofits evolve. And I think that, speaking for myself, I think that that's a lot of what motivates the kind of work that brings me here.
I'm going to see if there's anyone in the room who has questions. Yeah, we've got a hand right here. We've got, Wubzena has a mic. Remember, you're being videotaped. That matters to you.
Not sure if it matters or not. Hi. My name is Andre Nada. I'm actually one of the Knight Journalism Fellows here this year, and I'm a former nonprofit professional.
I'm sorry.
It gets scarier later on. So everything you talked about is important, but what level of importance is it for the people whose data you're collecting to understand what's going on. And how would that help influence the way that nonprofits and those that are using the information actually collect it and then use it later on?
Great question. Did you have anyone in mind or to everyone?
I think it's everything.
Perfect. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll just say, I'm working from the perspective, I'm trying to work from the perspective of people whose data is being collected, right? So we're trying to understand, help people understand what their so-called threat model is, right? What are your adversaries, and what do you have? What are people trying to get? What resources do they have to try to get that stuff, right? It's the mirror image of a large organization that does good, but it does good in part by collecting and aggregating large data sets and possibly sharing it, right? Those things are kind of at odds with each other, unless we can find a way to ensure that that those data sets are being dealt with responsibly, right? And you use that word, and you're thinking about that, right? But it's not an easy question. You can't just flip a switch and things are responsible now. You spend years thinking about, and this is what the data governance stuff is all about, thinking about how to manage data sets that include the names and giving information and histories and other data attached to millions of people. And as we all know, large companies are not so good at being responsible about that because it's kind of not their job to be responsible. It's their job to mine it for profit. So we don't have great models there for how to manage that kind of scale in a way that minimizes impact on the individual, which is the person that we're trying to work with in the first place.
You can tell we don't work on the same project because because I keep trolling Josh. One of the reasons that I'm focused on trust as a legal construct is because they're literally called trust. And one of the things that you can do with a trust is create fiduciary duties. And that means fiduciary duties means legally significant responsibilities to represent the best interests of people. And so we do have, one of the models that we have are fiduciary agents. If you ever hire a lawyer, if you ever work with an insurance broker, often if you work with a doctor, if you've ever given anyone a power of attorney, these are all times when you have given someone some limited authority to make decisions on your behalf with the legal responsibility to represent your best interests. So it's not to say that trusts are the solution to this, but I think that we, particularly in the social sector, who ask more and ask for more sensitive data, we ask for more privileged communication, I think we owe a duty to the people that we interact with. And one of the reasons that I find trust so compelling is because they're a way to legally create those duties in ways that are enforceable and are actionable and can hopefully start to build regular expectations around the ways that our data will be treated. That's not going to stop bad actors. It's not going to prevent anything, but it's a tool in the kit. And I think that Josh has done a lot of great work, and Asha, we're all here trying to figure out how do we build trustworthy, mature ecosystems that support the things that communities expect of us based on what we tell them we care about and want to do. And we're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, for sure, but I think starting with the long precedents that have come before us is a way to start modeling, taking old models and adapting them to sort of the new infrastructure in which we find ourselves.
And I think it's a critical question. Asha works with a lot of partners outside of the U.S., and the lab has actually been doing a lot of work outside of the U.S. this year. And one of the things I actually hear in the U.S. and outside, is civil society. What's that? So there's this idea that we have any right or responsibility to make decisions about people who are living their lives and who we think we're the bee's knees for, but they may not even know we exist as a thing, is humbling, to say the very least. But I also, each of us is a data subject also. That's the other possibility. That's why I think recognizing the range of voices that now can and should be part of this decision-making about this particular resource is a driver of fundamental change in what we think of as what civil society is. Because we're used to it being these kind of organizations that have a certain look to them. But they don't need to look like that anymore. There's a question here, and then we'll go back to the back. Sorry. Thanks, Wabzena.
There we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Ware from Microsoft. Maybe I'm about to get myself in trouble. We'll see. So another ecosystem question, building on some of the things you said, Josh, but I think for everybody too. The technology that underlies everything we're talking about here. So there are the cloud services where the data is stored, the email services where we move it around, even the social media platforms, where Givingtuesday happens. All of those things were designed for enterprise and for consumers. They're not designed for the social sector. They never have been. And even the companies like Benevity or Benetech or arguably Mozilla that are building for the social sector are building with Legos that come from the commercial and consumer sector. So 2 questions. One, does that matter? Does that sort of undermine the endeavors that we're talking about here? Since we all rely on this technology to do the work. And 2, if you had, 100 virgin engineers right out of Stanford who had never been part of any larger entity, and you got to structure them in any way or have them build anything, like you have the ability to build this technology, but no apparatus or governance structure around it yet, what would you do with them?
I'm going to let the panel answer. I have very clear answers to those questions.
Okay. The answer to the first question, yeah, it's a huge problem. And I think one of the things that I see as someone who runs a small business and worry about not seeing it in more of the headlines until very recently is that often the business model is the problem. And the infrastructure that we're using to sort of interact with modern business models creates a reliance. I don't think that that's a reason for inaction. I think that empowering the social sector to interact in those ecosystems, to create advocates for the things that we believe in is an important first step. It may not always rebalance the table, but I think that right now and without the social sector, not to say that right now is without the social sector, but that without a digitally literate, without a digitally versed or savvy civil society, the table's far more out of balance. The 100 engineer question, I don't know, I maybe asking to get a liberal arts degree too. It's, I don't think that I don't think that the major problems that we're encountering are primarily engineering problems. And I think that, whether you're talking about the humanities or you're talking about anthropology or you're talking about law or you're talking about any number of other disciplines, the sort of centrality of engineering in the conversation as though we will always be able to engineer a solution is something that kind of concerns me. I think that there's lots and lots of fantastic engineering happening, and what I would invest that amount of talent in is sort of building organizational infrastructure, interoperability, kind of fluidity in that system to make it more flexible and adaptable and inclusive of people who may not be engineers.
100 engineers, what are you going to do with them? Or you can answer the other question also.
No, I like the 100 engineers question, but I really agree with that. And I think it's not a matter of inventing the next new thing or inventing some magic tool that will kind of standardize data collection and reporting and privacy and security globally. I would probably deploy them to work with some of our partner nonprofits who have very little in the way of technological infrastructure or resource and to help them out by building very basic things that maybe nonprofits here in the United States take for granted. But I think it's as much a language issue as it is a technological issue. And what I mean by that is that I think that people who speak, I love the phrase that you used, intellectually dense, because I think that part of the problem is the impenetrability of the data and digital world of knowledge by so many people who work in the social sector and just don't understand it, and so are alienated and isolated from even thinking about it. And I think that's a big problem, right? I think that people who are experts can often speak in a way that does nothing but show what experts they are. And that's the kind of chief result of how they talk, and no one else feels enfranchised in that conversation, even less so that sort of like, well, maybe I can do that too, right? Or maybe I can adopt those same tools or that same expertise. One of my favorite stories is my boss, Henry Timms, was out here at an event at Facebook, where Facebook kind of gathered all these do-gooders from various sectors. There were like global development people and tech people and so forth, and he said, how many people in the room know what an API is? And half the people, raised their hand. And then he said, how many people know what the SDGs are? And the other half raised their hand. And like, that's the problem in a nutshell, right? Is that the same people don't know, what the major issues are, what nonprofits are actually working to address on a daily basis, that like dozens and dozens of real issues, right? And then the people who speak digital and who speak data, right? I think of like they're the wonks and the geeks, but they speak either wonk or they speak geek, and you gotta speak both. Like so I'm like very little wonk and kind of a little geek and a whole lot of neither one of those. And what that forces me to do is to speak human, right? And as far as like successful network or coalition building goes, I think that's as much of a motivating factor as any kind of expertise.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yes, there's an insane over-reliance on corporate platforms by civil society, and it's very damaging to them. It's not to say that the corporate platforms are bad, but they're not, as you say, built with the needs of human rights activists or social justice organizers in mind. They're not built with privacy or security in mind. Those things, if they exist, are tacked on or there are surface-level Band-Aids or messaging websites. That's not to say that's not everything, right? But I think that, there was always a mantra over the last 10 years, we hate to use Facebook, but you have to go where people are. And I think in the last year that has really changed. Because I saw, Beth Cantor, who's written about how organizations can use social media forever, and written a zillion books about it, just wrote a blog post kind of acknowledging that this is a real problem. That data mining and data aggregation and corporate surveillance and the algorithmic black boxes are starting to really hurt civil society. And so we don't have an answer to fixing that. Any attempt to create grassroots alternatives to things like Facebook haven't worked. If I had 100 engineers, I agree with everything the two of you said, but if I had another 100 engineers, I would ask them to build a full stack alternative to a lot of the corporate platforms that we rely on. And that means having email that you can trust, hosted in a place that you can trust, document sharing hosted in a place that you can trust, that you have control over, social sharing and communications platforms that are truly encrypted and don't necessarily encrypt your communications but still tie your profile to your non-encrypted communications, things like that. I would do it in a way in which there is federated hosting infrastructure that doesn't place anything in one location or in even one continent. And there's a lot more that I would do, but I'm not going to bore you with it.
It's a good thing there's 100 engineers. There was another question.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah. I'm Zeth Dubois. I'm from the University of Idaho. I'm not here officially. I'm just crashing your party. And actually...
Welcome.
Yes? Welcome. Thank you. I wanted to thank Asha because now I realize I have my new homework assignment is to figure out what SDG is. So I know now that I'm a geek and not a wonk.
Not a wonk. I can tell you.
Currently, right. So I'm going to try to articulate this question, or maybe a statement. I'm noticing, we've heard this word security spoken about 300 times, and privacy maybe 150, being a little bit hyperbolic about that. But and this seems to be the interesting tipping point, or maybe the fulcrum of this conversation, because I haven't heard anything about. I mean, to me, at the moment, the issue with security is that privacy and privacy and security are actually currently our modalities, the way we're practicing them, mutually exclusive conditions. Basically, I'm looking forward to the moment that I turn on my Windows workstation, and the next WannaCry virus comes up and lets me know that my 1 terabyte Dropbox account has been hacked, and I can now look forward to paying a ransom to get all my data back. And this seems to be the issue that I'm trying to bring up, is that of all of the ideas that we're sort of vaguely discussing, it comes at a like a policy level. And Sean, you mentioned this a little bit a while ago, that perhaps we're moving into an era now where we have to think about how to organize things differently than we used to. So this is not, security isn't the Mona Lisa anymore. It's not one item that we can secure with locks. Digital security means that as soon as it's out, and everyone has it. And thanks to Equifax, one of us might be might be entering Syria right now with our passports, and we don't know that. And so basically, I guess what I'm trying to ask, if you can, the question might be, at what point are we going to readdress that privacy and security, in order for them to coexist, means that we need to control our own data, and we need to authenticate ourselves with our own data. And there are some projects out there that are doing this,
Right.
And we know that there's actually currently one project that has an $80 billion bug bounty on it, and no one's cracked it, but the DNC can't keep their emails locked up,
Right.
and Equifax can't keep my social security number safe. So.
Right. I'll let anyone respond who wants to, but I think, this is the ocean that the fish are swimming in. These are issues. I absolutely agree. These are the big issues. The question, part of the question is, what is civil society's responsibility in all of this? That's the second side of the Mobius strip for the lab. Civil society only exists as individuals decide, hey, maybe we ought to own our own data. Now, many of the actual attempts to put people back in charge of their data that I'm aware of are projects being incubated within civil society. They're at least they're outside of the strict marketplace, and they're outside of the government. So one possible picture is that civil society becomes an incubating place for alternatives to the world that we've all that we all walked into rather in exchange for 2-day free shipping. Let me put it that way. Some of us walked slower than others, and some of us ran as fast as we could, but it's the world that we built. Civil society does have a responsibility in that, to possibly be part of the change. It also has a responsibility to continue trying to do the work that it's doing now. And again, back to the comment from the first question, civil society is a concept that most of the people who are actively participating in it are unaware of the concept. So that's a little complicating. I don't have the answer. These are by no means meant to be the full solution set. I have got an email this morning from Mark Rottenberg at EPIC. If you're not familiar with EPIC, it's a not-for-profit organization based in Washington, D.C. that spends most of its time filing lawsuits about the way your privacy has been violated. And it is an active participant in civil society around these issues. And he and many others are of the mindset that The solutions include privacy-enhancing technologies and fundamentally changing the behavior of everybody in this room about anything you would ever think to put in your email, on your social media, or share with somebody electronically. And until we get to that point, for all 9 billion people on the planet, yes, Equifax hack means that probably more than one person in this room is currently being posed as by several other people elsewhere in the world, absolutely. I'm actually going to use the moderator's prerogative in the fact that I'm getting the high sign. Is there another question in the audience? We can close with an audience question if there is. Yeah, let's take 2 more quick questions. If we could just get the questions back to back, we'll get the answers, and then we'll wrap it up. And you don't have to hear from me anymore.
Okay. Hi, Willie Costello. I'm a philosopher here. This is just kind of directly following up on what Lucy's just said in the previous 2 questions. We've talked a lot about like the responsibility of civil society for data security and protecting these things, but it also seems to me that civil society has a real opportunity right now to leverage these issues.
Absolutely.
And in providing this sort of alternative to the corporate marketplace and government. And so if you want to say anything about how that is figuring in your thoughts right now and kind of mobilizing these sentiments that people are feeling
Yeah.
and becoming more aware of as a way to sort of just emphasize the importance of civil society in this current culture.
Nice, good question. So, and then let's get the other question, and we'll let the panelists.
Speak loudly. My voice for
It's just for the recording purposes, if you don't mind. Thanks.
It's okay. Hi, my name's Anna Burns. I worked at Benetech in the Human Rights Program for a long time, so I thought a lot about the security side of data issues, and we focused a lot on keeping the data secure and letting the civil society groups we were working with choose whether or not they would share their data and what they would share.
Yeah.
But it was an ongoing challenge because people kept coming to us saying, well, can you tell us the data that people are collecting, and can you share that information, and how can, and we basically said, no, we can't. And I'm just curious whether any of you have examples of organizations or platforms that are good examples of keeping the data secure, but still thinking of ways in which you can share it so people can learn from it. And so I'd love to hear if you have thoughts on that.
So 2 questions. Take your pick. The real responsibility and opportunity for civil society to offer alternatives to the norms, behaviors, practices we've become accustomed to. And this question for examples of organizations that are meeting the dilemma. They're finding something to share, but also being able to secure and make that trusted argument to their constituents.
Can I address the first question?
You can address either of them, but only one, because
Yep.
the lights are going out.
Okay.
If you haven't noticed.
So to that first question, I think civil society, in addition to just thinking about the kind of the infrastructure that they use and that they want to use, there are things to advocate for. We need a regulatory regime that understands privacy and security much more than any current regulatory regime does, right? And we need a way to understand what kind of responsibilities large platforms have and should have, and ways to enforce certain, those kinds of responsibilities. And I think civil society is going to be the leader when it comes to advocating for those things. I think that we need to advocate directly to the platforms to make certain changes to the way that they run, right? They need to hear from their users about things that those users are uncomfortable with. It's not enough for Facebook, for example, and I don't mean to pick on them because there's a lot of actors out there, but it's not enough for them to get the bad headlines. I think that they need to actually fear the revolt of their users, and I think there's a huge opportunity for Facebook users, which is all of us basically, to organize in favor of certain certain things that Facebook needs to do to make some significant changes. And then I think that civil society can also try to eat some of its own dog food and make some risky switches when it comes to who they rely on for infrastructure.
That's good?
Yes, okay.
Perfect.
Done.
Asha.
labs. That's right. I think you answered that question very well in terms of the first one. So I wanted to answer yours, but now I've forgotten what it is.
There's examples of organizations that share information that can be used to improve the work while
Yeah.
also protecting.
So the organizations in my experience that are doing that really, really well are organizations like Donors Choose, which is a crowdfunding platform that teachers use to put up projects that are then funded directly by people. And what they do is, or what they've done with Givingtuesday certainly, is to do a lot of A/B testing with their email base or their donor base, their patrons, to learn lessons about what works and what doesn't work in terms of solicitations, and then to have their biggest days ever, and then to go on and replicate that success over and over again, which seems to me to be a really smart use of having the access to those people, and something that we'd like to see happen more. I mean, this. I might have a completely different perspective on this a year from now than I do now that this is the reason that I'm here. But it feels like this data in the social sector exists. It is massive. It is robust. There must be a way for us to protect people's privacy, to think in really smart ways about security and about governance, and yet to learn as much as we can to enable the people who are doing good work all over the world to do it better.
Sean, either question, but just one. 58 seconds.
Yeah, so I think basically the role of civil society is to accept duties that other organizations won't. And I think that when I say duty, I mean literal legal duty. I respect the intentions of good actors, but I think that duty is where it all hits road. And I think that there are, you know, Muhammad Yunus, at one point, one of the people who invented the kind of microcredit market, said that the difference between a social enterprise and a normal enterprise is percentage of profit margin and nothing else. And you may agree with that, you may disagree with that, but I think that the operational manifestations of our intentions are what bring all of us here and are the sort of core of the work that we're doing. And there are good examples, there are more bad examples, but I think that the role that we're trying to play is creating the infrastructure to help those who would do the right thing do it more easily, more cheaply, and more effectively. And from my perspective, you know, that is such a compelling opportunity in the rapid change of so many things that in a lot of ways the role of civil society has never been more important.
Fantastic. Well done. Join me in thanking the panel. I want to thank you for asking better questions than I did. I also want to let those of you who are on campus on Thursday, October 12th, coming up, if you're interested in careers in digital security in particular, the lab is hosting a lunch with Josh that you're welcome to join us for, and you can find out some more information about that through the same sources that you found out information about this event. The fellows are, it's a year-long process. We hope to have other opportunities to share your work as it progresses, and thank you again for joining us.
So I get to add just a quick thank you to Lucy as well for leading the conversation, and also add a thanks to Microsoft and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation who support the Fellows Program, not only the practitioners who are here in front of you and working this year, but also our postdoctoral fellows who are also in the room and work with Lucy and Rob, our faculty director at the lab, for all through the year and are here full time. So thank you again for coming, and please join us again soon. We do this often. Thanks.
Thank you.